All right, perfect. Welcome back, guys. We're going to be looking at a new class. We looked at economy very recently. We looked at money. We looked at different ways of gaining that money. Okay, now we're going to be looking at just the ults. Okay, we're going to be looking at different ways of keeping your ults active, and we're going to look at different ways in which you can use these ults to keep pressure. Okay, ultimates are really important. They're really big game changers in the game of Valorant. So we're going to be looking at different ways on which we can keep these ults going. And that's what the ult economy is about. Okay. So the first few things is, of course, we're going to be looking at the basics. What is going to give you an ult? But then we're going to be looking a little bit into the ult orbs. They're really important in the game of Valorant. They've been added intentionally. And last but not least, we're going to be looking at the types of ults. We're not going to get too concrete on what exactly a particular ult is, but we're going to be giving you ways of categorizing them so you can create strategies ahead of time. Okay. After that, we're going to be looking at 3 different forms of looking at keeping your ult economy intact. We're going to be looking at farming. We're going to be looking at cycling or the domino effect. And then we're going to be looking at baiting and trading. We're going to be looking at a game as well from 2023 from PRX versus DRX. It's on Breeze. And we're going to be looking at a really interesting strat where they use Yoru in order to be able to create plays. So this one's a pretty interesting one. So in case you're really curious, again, just hold your questions, keep yourself muted, and then just wait until I kind of give you guys a chance to really ask. You can ask at any point in time if you're going to be using the chat, however. Okay, let's get going. So first few things first. On the basics, there's a handful of ways of getting ults. Okay, you can get a kill, you can die, you can plant, and you can defuse the spike. These are all ways in which you can interact with your environment and you can get an ult point. Usually, depending on the ult that you have, you can get like either you can get it really quickly. So for example, Phoenix ult, you can get it in 6 points, but something like KJ ult, this image is a little outdated, but you can get something like a KJ ult much after. Okay, those ones use a lot more ults, and that's because the more powerful the ult, the more points it's going to use. Now, of course, you can say that with a little bit of a grain of salt because a really good player can use a 6-point ult like Phoenix ult and still get a handful of kills and maybe even clutch a round, whereas someone with a KJ ult can misuse it and maybe get nothing out of it, right? So there's a little bit of, some truth to the fact of how strong the ult is. But we're going to notice when we categorize these ults that the stronger the ult in terms of, forcing your way into a site, or the stronger the ult as it has been shown to be in pro play or even higher elos, they kind of use that to kind of gauge how strong an ult can be. Okay, then with that, the cost. We're going to be also looking at ult orbs. Okay, we're going to be looking at that, but ult orbs, let's actually start talking about them right now. At their most basic form, okay, these are just orbs that are scattered around the map. Depending on the map, you might just see 2 of them. There was one map that had 3 of them, and we have Fracture that has 4 of them. Okay, this might change in the future. This is as it is right now. One thing you're going to notice about the reason why they took an ult orb out of Lotus is because of how powerful these ult orbs are, right? We're going to be talking about farming in just a second, but based on what I'm telling you, you can probably infer what I'm trying to say. These orbs are in highly contested areas. Usually it's not very easy to just grab an orb. Normally you have to use teamwork or multiple numbers in order for you to be able to get them. If you're someone that likes to lurk or you like to stay behind, you might be able to use map knowledge. You might be able to see what your team is doing, what the enemy team is doing, right? If you're doing all of that, then you can kind of start paying attention to how many ult orbs you're getting. And then from there, you can kind of escalate depending on what you're doing, right? The devs have put a lot of thought into these orbs, right? One ult a round can make a difference. And this is why when you have a missing player, you'll have these ult orbs appear in your spawn, because one orb around can get you a lot of things really quickly. And we're going to notice how these orbs can kind of create different environments in which you can kind of use your ultimates to create more pressure. So there's 4 different ways. I'm sure there's more. It's a really non-binary system in which you can do it. It's yes or no, whether it's an engage ult. There's a lot of different ults that can fit into different areas and different categories. Okay. The way that we're going to categorize ults is that we're going to be boiling them down into these formats so we can kind of use them to see how diverse or creative a player can be. Because again, a playstyle can change the dynamic of the ult. So for example, someone can use Omen ult, and then they can use it to be able to flank. And they can use it as a form of cleanup ult or an information ult, right? Other people can use it as an area of denial. They can use it to quickly rotate into another area to capture like maybe a site before an opponent can reach it, right? You have to look at different ways of how an ult can be used. Okay, so we're going to explain all of these four, and then we're going to talk about some examples before we move on to some strategies. Oh, and before we continue, does anyone have any questions? No questions? Perfect. Okay, let's look into the engage ult. This one is pretty common, okay? These are designed to take areas by force. These are used to take heavily contested spaces and can make it really easy to access. This can be really used against defending opponents, and they can be really useful at breaking down defenses regardless of whether you're on attack or on defense. Really useful ults like Breach Ult, as shown here, can be used to essentially shut down a complete area for the entire team to be able to just take over, right? These are really powerful ults that can be used on both the retake or the attack side of things in order to be able to get space back, because you're basically taking it by force. You can look at duelist ults like Jet Ult as a form of engagement ult. Of course, you can look at the difference between a Jet Ult and maybe for example, something like a Breach Ult. The varying capacity of how the engage depends on the player and the team you're with. If you don't have a team that can follow up with a Breach Ult, then you're really getting nothing out of it. But if you have a really strong Jet that can get basically 5 kills just with the ult alone, then it can be a really strong form of pressure as you're taking that site. Despite the fact that they fulfill the same job, they're not within the same structure of power just because of the amount of investment that you have to put into an ult. For example, you can't get a Breach ult within 4 rounds unless you're doing really, really, really well, right? Whereas when you're playing something like Jet, you can get it pretty quickly by the 4th round. So you have to make sure that you're gauging between these form of engage ults and kind of categorizing them at how strong they are in taking a site. Engage ults are really easy to read because, for example, let's say you're seeing an enemy team has KJ ult and they're about to run into a site. What your first expectation is going to be, they're going to be using KJ ult if we hold them by the choke, right? So they're really easy to read, and then depending on how strong the ult is and how high in the hierarchy it is, you can use it to gain more knowledge on how this ult is going to be used. So engage ults, pretty straightforward, okay? Be very mindful of these ults, be very mindful of how you're playing against them, okay? The second one that we're going to be looking at is a pretty self-explanatory one, area denial. So we looked at engage ults, which are pretty good at taking space away or space back. Area denial is a way of basically locking down areas, right? We've seen a lot of maybe, for example, VODs from lower elos, maybe in the more metal ranks like silver and gold. They'll have something like a KJ ult, and they don't want their site to be taken, so they'll just put it right down. That is a form of locking down an area. That is a way of taking space away from the opponent and keeping it for yourself. Of course, you can misuse ults like that, like we mentioned in that example, right? A better example of locking down an area can be something like using Viper ult. The enemy, if they cross in, they're basically coming into an area that is not favorable. This is a form of area denial. You can use a lot of different ults that can kind of categorize into this area. Astro Wall is a good one, right? Besides Viper ult, you can look at things like Harbor ult is really good at basically being area denial. Or an engage ult, for example. I've seen some people use Raze ult as a form of area denial. People are coming down a lane, and then Raze ult is then being used to lock down a particular lane. You can use these ults to force the opposition away from the site or away from the area they're attacking. With a really good team, by the way, you can use strats like the ones I just showed with Raze ult or maybe putting down a KJ ult, and with a really good team, you can catch a rotating opponent, or you can catch an opponent that's staying back off guard, and you can catch them defenseless as your team basically cleans them up. Make sure that you're using area denial as a form of keeping them away from really big hotspots, for example, sites, or really strong choke points by any site in particular, right? Make sure you're picking those areas carefully, but they can be really useful in completely locking down spaces away from the opponent. Cleanup, I think, also pretty self-explanatory. This can be from something like using a Brim ult to close up a round against somebody that's diffusing, or using something like Cloves ult, okay? The Clove Res can be used to basically clean up the round in case your team doesn't have enough players, or you can use it to finish up a kill. These are all really useful with cleaning up gunfights, or just ensuring a round victory just because of the amount of pressure that you can provide in such a small period of time. Now, of course, cleanup ults are not too particularly straightforward. It can be something as using a Viper ult to clean up the round because you're going to be locking down an area, and then you can combine those two together. Or it can be something as simple as using Reyna ult to clean up multiple kills and then just make sure that you ensure the round. Okay, cleanup can be used in a variety of different ways. So make sure that you're looking at how you're going to be changing the tide with cleanup. Cleanup is usually a backup plan, or it's usually the last resort that people kind of come to when things go wrong. So again, Brim ult is gonna be used when everybody else is dead, or to keep kits together and everybody else can run away, right? So make sure you're looking into that when you're paying attention to how people will use an ult for cleanup. Okay. Last but not least, information. Information is kind of weird because it actually matches with a lot of different ults. So for example, you can use something like a Fade ult as a form of engage, but if nothing gets picked up, then you know that there's no one on site. And that can also be a form of information. You can use something like Sky ult, and you can use it to locate opponents. And as you're looking for opponents, you can also figure out there's no one in sight. We can use it to take it in, and it can be a form of engage. Information ults have a lot of different variants of use. Again, it depends on how dynamic the player is and how adaptable they are. But the big part about it is adapting. You got to make sure that you're ready to adapt on the field. Make sure you're ready to be able to use it. So Cypher ult, for example, you can use it in the middle of a round as you guys are in the middle of a firefight to clean up some kills. It can be a cleanup ult. But if you guys are rotating and you catch somebody off guard, you can use it to locate opponents and then adapt on which side you're going to hit. Okay. You can add different attributes of each ult into each one that we're looking at, but make sure you're paying attention to the quality of the ult and basically what you want out of it. So for example, you can use Sova ult to clean up a kill. Maybe you caught them on the drone and you're about to kind of clean up a quick kill or maybe a free kill on the opponent. But as you're doing that, you're basically scanning areas that the opponent might be in. So you can also use something like a Sova ult as a form of information. So if you don't catch anyone, you can instead use it to clean up common corners, to maybe get the opponent into an unfavorable position as your team entries or the enemy entries. Okay, use that to your advantage. Use these categories to try to identify what the enemy might do next. Okay, now that we understand ultimates a little bit better, we're going to be jumping into strategy. Does anyone have any questions before we jump into strategy? This is the meat of the class. Does anyone have any questions in regards to how ultimates can be classified? Anything of the sort?
I have one.
Go ahead.
How would you classify a Yoru ult?
We're going to be looking
Because
at that.
technically, on one hand, you could sit there and classify it as more of an engagement ult, depending on how you're using it, but it can also be more classified as an information gathering ult.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that. We're going to be looking at that just now. And I think your answer is going to be pretty much playing into this slide. So I'm not going to fully answer it. But yes, you can actually combine his ult into multiple different categories. It can also be used as a cleanup ult because you can put a shorty on the character and then you can just jump in. Right?
Exactly.
It just depends on how you're using it.
That's my entire point, is like the way it's used really just, it makes it hard to classify.
Yep, for sure. There's a lot of them. A lot of them are hard to classify. Like I mentioned, Sky ult has a lot of different uses. I saw you typing, Phantom. Do you still want to get your question across? And what category does Sage ult fall into? Depending on how you're playing it, it generally falls into more of an engage ult if you think about it. You can think of something like, okay, I'm going to be letting our duelists go in, and they're less afraid of taking the fight. And now you have an extra player that can be used as that form of engagement, right? Because they have that something to fall back onto. You can also use it as a form of cleanup. You can use that information, you can use that to basically get an opponent to catch them off guard or get a numbers advantage. You can use it to ensure victory the same way that you use Brim ult. You can also use it as a form of information. In a 1v1, you can res somebody, and then if your teammate dies while resing, then you know where the enemy is going to be as they made noise. So depending on how you're trying to use it, you can see that it has a lot of different uses as well. But it's a matter of you thinking about the category that allows you to come up with strats. I'm basically putting them right up there for everybody to kind of see and kind of process. So you know that you're not in the wrong for thinking of the different ways of thinking about it. Because I've always told this to players, you are much more aware of the game than you let go or let be. There's sometimes so many things that you're processing at such rapid speeds that you don't really trust your gut. You know that an opponent might be flanking. How do you know? We don't have trips, but you don't voice it. You don't say anything, right? Stuff like that comes into fruition, and you need to see it visually in order for it to come in and be better processed. So this is why I'm kind of showing you those categories. So yeah, those are the 3 different categories I can put Stage Alt into. So again, it's just about processing that information. Okay. All right, let's move on. So when we're looking at farming, so we talked a little bit about alt orbs. Okay. So the strategy of farming is something that you can use when you're looking at your strategy. It's one of those things where you can flesh out the best components of your ult, sorry, not your ult, of your agents and in the comp that you have. So a good example of this is something that we're going to be seeing today. So we're going to be looking at PRX versus DRX. And one thing that we noticed about this particular game is how they use orbs in order to gain space and in order to be able to farm ults for later rounds. Okay. When you're looking at the strategy of farming, you can do this at any point in time. You can do it in the case of maybe asking your team to default. You can do it in the case of looking for picks. You can do it in the case of a fake. You can do it in the case of doing a split and then that fails and you can fall back into something like that. Farming doesn't have to be the strat themselves. It can be a form of a component to a strat. So in this scenario right here, we're going to be doing a fake and then go into B. But you're going to notice that we're going to be using this fake with the component of farming. Okay. So you can see this is 2023. Halls has not been reopened yet, but it could have been for a strat like this. So we're going to be looking at this round, and I already mentioned it before. I need to make sure that you guys, wait, let's see. Well, that's gone. Let's see if I can kind of show it to you guys here. We're going to be pulling up the slides. Perfect. Can you guys see the player right here?
See a black screen.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to be looking at this idea of farming, of being able to use space, being able to use this whole idea of how we're going to be working with the different components of a fight. And we're going to be using them to basically gain our ults. So we're going to look at this example and look at how they pay attention to the ultimates and pay attention to the rounds. Right now we have 2 rounds and we're going to be looking at the different ults that everybody has. In 2 rounds, Forsaken on the Yoru already has 4 points. Jet already has 4 points. And then Sova already has 5 points. Okay. Whereas on the other side, we can see that only one of the characters, the one that's doing the best and dying the most, is getting most of their ults. So how is that happening? Only one player is doing really well on DRX's side and is almost at their ult. Whereas everybody else is kind of somewhere in the middle, yet they're almost at the same amount of ult points as the one that's doing really well. And this is already 2 rounds finished, okay? We are on the 3rd round. So paying attention to that element, let's look at how this adds up to the rest of the round.
We'll see if he's continuing to be able to support his teammates with the utility as well.
Pay attention to a Yoru
as we go into this 3rd round with Paper X now on their back foot. Only a Guardian and Bulldog in hand.
We now have a new ult point.
Early high tide here from Harbor to cut up mid. Allows Buzz to put some extra pressure. Something has crept up though, and Zast on the drop there.
So you can see,
can't stabilize the aim.
to
The
kind of
Sheriff
take that
battles
space.
bouncing back and forth between these 2 teams. So it's deep. Oh my God. Oh, they finally spotted.
Down.
So he had TP'd right to the left of the door and then gotten underneath the Harbor utility to sneak up there. So Forsaken almost able to pull off a pretty nice play, but barely
we give the
recognized
second
and
most
stopped in
powerful
time.
ult over here that we have. We're going to give him the spike so we
that
can plant.
shock dart. Only 25 HP to his name. The Paranoia early just to buy time from Monette. It's trying to allow a setup here for something to go for this flank, and he will find that shot onto RB. And there is another member as well. This is another
we
double
can kind of
flank.
see that by the end of the
Buzz
round, we have a
trying to
lot of
clear the
ults. Notice how this leads into the next strategy.
Now, and he'll have the...
You're going to notice right here that we're going to have a Yoru essentially set up a gate crash. And what's going to happen is the Yoru is almost there, right? We're going to see the Yoru is almost there. And because of the previous round, because of the way that we were using farming to get this ult right here, we're now able to get other ults. We have, I believe we're down...
Dimensional Drift, if he gets that ult for free. DRX continuing to give that up.
Yeah, we're short 1 ult point over here. Notice how being able to use this farming strategy now allows us to get more ults onto the
Now
field.
he puts on some pressure on A and then immediately teleports out to help clear the site here on B. Trap wires being located for
they
his
use this as an informational.
Jump
Now they're
across.
also
Buzz
going
has
to
been
try to use
spotted.
it
The
to kind
flash
of
out,
kills.
and Forsaken immediately finds his target. Site broken open by the Yoru from Paper Rex. RB on the flank.
Using the strategy, we're now able to kind of like use one ult to gain a site, and now we've gained 2 ults basically out of it. Not only have we used the strategy to gain 1 ult, but now 2. This ult was gained last round, this ult was gained this round.
When
And if you look at the economy after
everyone,
this,
jeez, that Viper's
Forsaken, you know, like,
if we look at the economy after this, we only have 1 ult on the field on the enemy side, whereas we have 3 ults. We used 1 already, and then we have 2 right after. And notice how many other ults are about to come back. Yoru ult is about to get his ult back, and we can see the other 2 over here about to get theirs as well. Okay, so this is the process of farming. You're incorporating a strategy of looking at orbs and being able to use them to power other ults. Okay, so let's kind of move on from here. Let's see. And let's bring back slide. Okay. So using this, we've now seen how farming can be used to kind of, or at least how it can be used in pro play. I'm not sure if you can really incorporate on every ranked game, but we can now see how you can use these farming strategies to guarantee a bunch of ults, and you can use them to keep your economy up. Okay. Again, notice the amount of ults that we had, right? We used this to then gain a couple more ults. What we just saw right after from the farming example, though, we noticed that they used the Yoru ult to gain an edge. But then this Yoru ult then led to another ult being gained by something. Something was able to basically get it as they were farming back and forth. And then after that, we were able to gain this ult. And then instead of basically using it and then just, using another ult, we're instead able to get this ult as well. Okay. And like we saw at the end of the round, we noticed that these characters basically were able to mostly get all of their ults after 3 rounds complete, right? 3 or 4 rounds. So the process that we just saw is the strategy, or at least the concept of cycling. Okay, it's a domino-like effect where you build one ult, you use that ult to power another player's playstyle, and then they can get their ult. Okay, what's happening is when you gain this form of edge, you can sort of create a sort of system where you can chain the amount of ults that you can get all together. Okay, so one ult can build off of one another, and then this way you can keep cycling them, and this is why it's called cycling. So for example, in this scenario, Yoru used his ult, then this guy can get his ult. If we weren't strong enough or we weren't fast enough to get that ult, we can do something like using this ult to finish up Sova ult, and then Sova ult can be used to maybe get Omen ult, and then Omen ult can be used to then gain something like Viper ult, assuming that these are constants and nothing's changing that quickly, right? When this is happening and you're cycling ults and you're using one ult to gain the next, you can use it as a form of constant pressure. You can use it to maintain ults, you can use it to maintain a lead in your fights, and you can also use it to force the opponent to use theirs. So maybe your end goal isn't to really use Jet ult to get some sort of massive win from it, but you can instead use it to force the opponent to fight back. Oh, they're going to be using Jet ult, we're going to be positioning in a way where the Jet ult is not as important, right? You can basically cause counter strategies to be forced. Of course, in a perfect world, you would be able to use each one of these ults and then cycle them onto the next. And by the time that you're done your last ult, your first ult should be almost back at the beginning, right? However, that's not what happens. Okay. It is not bound to happen, or at the very least, cycling ults will stop at some point. Okay. And this is where trading ults comes in. Okay. Trading ults is the most natural state of ultimates, and normally cycling will never go as planned. There's a lot of different things that people can do. Okay, so let's pay attention a little bit as to how cycling and trading can come into play. Okay, cycling again is used within one team. Trading is when both teams start acknowledging the ults in the field. Okay, so if we're paying attention to the competition, we can start paying attention to how many ults can be deployed at once. So this is one example that we're looking at. We're looking at Sova ult competing against KJ ult, right? You would have to use the entirety of your ult and focus it down in order to be able to kill KJ ult, right? Making these trades and having these trades in mind when you're making a play is an example of paying attention to baiting an ult and maybe, for example, trading it, okay? Most of the time, you will find yourself in a scenario where you use something like KJ ult, and then maybe they'll use something with maybe like a Sova ult, and then your teammate will say, okay, well, now we're back at 0. I'm going to try to give us another edge, and they'll use Phoenix ult. So now you're up 1 ult. But then the opponent's going to go, okay, they're using this ult, I'm going to rebuttal with something like another ult, maybe breach ult, right? When you're looking at these things, you're going to notice that over time, you guys will just be basically fighting for who has the most amount of ults. I usually recommend against teams to not use more than 2 ults. Okay, let's pay attention and make sure that you're not using them all of them at once. Because what's happening is if you use all of them at once at one point, we're going to be basically halting the process of your ult economy. And if they still have one ult or an ult that's about to come back, it can cause problems where you lose that pressure. I've seen a lot of teams that have a 6-round lead and they have 3 ults and they'll blow them all into 1 round and they might not even win the round, but then after that they have no rounds to play back on or to trade or to be able to bait with. Okay, so make sure that you're paying attention to the ults you're using. Otherwise, you can lose a lot of rounds in a row because if you have no ults to come to fight back, the enemy can instead use that time to cycle the amount of ults that they have, and then the process repeats, right? So that out of the way, that's it. That's it for this one. Do you guys have any questions? And I know that last little bit might have seemed a little bit convoluted. And I'm not sure if you guys can hear it. There's a dog barking outside, so I'm gonna have to check that out. But does anyone have any questions in cycling, in trading, in baiting, any of that stuff? Do you guys have any questions?
If you can't communicate with your teammates, then what should you really do in that situation? And you can't cycle your ults.
So cycling is something that can naturally happen. So one thing that I should mention in the form of cycling, right? Let's see. Is it in cycling? I think it would be best if we talked about it. No, I think it makes the most sense in cycling. Cycling is not perfect. Okay. You can't force it all the time. So the one that I showed you when I was showing you that this game, the entire strategy revolved around this cycling process. Okay. If you're doing this in a team setting, it should be best for you guys to communicate the amount of ults that you guys are using. Okay. Pay attention to how easy one ult can be used to get value out of and how the enemy might counter that. Okay. So if your team is having a really hard time communicating and figuring out which ults to cycle, instead what you guys should focus on is trying to make sure that you get one ult instead of just cycling the rest. Because naturally what's going to happen is you guys are going to fight really hard for getting that Yoru ult, then maybe the others will fall into place as well. Okay. So if you're struggling to do that, make sure your team has a focus in mind. So let's give you the example of ranked. Okay. Breach is about to get his ult. Let's try to make sure Breach can get their ult. Okay. You might give them the spike so they can plant. You might be a duelist, so you flash out for them so they can take the space so they can get an orb, right? You can do all of these things as a player. You can be the one that's basically holding the breach if you're a support player as they're getting the orb. But notice how everybody can really easily focus on something very small. And that's something that I talked about in the communication class. If you keep it simple, if you keep it just very, very simple to the smallest terms, everyone is able to understand it, process it, and be able to work with it, right? So if your team is having a really hard time with that, at its most simplest form, then there's something inherently wrong with the team, okay? This can happen in ranked. Okay, not every game is winnable with your team, and this can happen in some teams that are just new or everybody's an amateur in terms of how much teamwork they've done, right? Some people just haven't been in a team in general, so they don't really process that stuff as quickly. That happens. It is a normal thing to occur. So you should kind of pay attention and see if you can make something like this happen. Everything else will happen right after. But to kind of finish up that question that you mentioned, what happens if maybe, for example, you can get this ult, but you can't end up cycling? Like I said, it's perfectly natural for that to happen because each player is autonomous and things like trading can occur, right? Maybe they'll have a reason for why they're using that ult. Okay, like I mentioned, someone used Phoenix ult, so they return back with Breach ult. It doesn't have to be a perfect one-to-one, but as long as you still have some ults to work with and your team understands the value of the ult that they used, you can still do something with it, right? So just be very mindful on what you're doing with that ult in general, I would say. Okay, does that answer your question, or is there something more that I can use to develop on that point?
That's all. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone have any other questions?
I do. So when it comes down to cycling, when you're the first one to get an ult in your team, is it best to use it as early as possible, or should you wait till your teammates are closer to their ult so you can begin the cycle process?
I think that is a two-part answer. So the first one is, I mean, I think it's one of those things where you already answered your question. So if you use it as quickly as possible, you already know the negatives, right? Your team might not get their ult fast enough, but if you pop off with it, let's say, for example, this person right here is the only one with their ult, right? Since this guy's about to get his ult, I'm sure that this person right here can just pop their ult, something can just go in and maybe do something with it, right? So this one's pretty easy to answer, right? But if no one's ready to come up with their ult, and it's really early in the game, I would probably suggest that you can probably use it. If it's an ult that's not going to be really crazy, or it's not one that's going to be doing a lot of work, so for example, a duelist ult, you can probably hold on to it. It's not going to make as much noise as you think it's going to do, unless you think you can make a lot of it. Make out a lot out of it, I meant. To really fully and wholly kind of like put it into terms, I think it's best if you hold on to it until somebody is like within a point or two of getting their ult, because that's a kill and then that's like a death, right? Or that's an orb and that's a death, or that's a kill and then that's a plant, right? So within those two, I would suggest that's as much leeway as you can give yourself. If it's like a 3-point difference, you're kind of relying on them to potentially get their ult, so I wouldn't really encourage it. So don't use it as quickly as possible unless you did something like play Jet and then you aced and then you got 2 kills. Then yeah, sure, pop off with it. You might be able to use that momentum to do other things like boost morale. You can use it to boost player count, so maybe you can use it because everybody's winning their fights. You can use a lot of money from that, right? So there's a lot more benefits that come from just using your ult earlier if you're popping off. But if you're like in the middle of the half and you are just getting your ult and nobody else is close to it, you can probably wait like a round or a round and a half before popping it, if that really answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone have any other questions? Now's a good time.
So by baiting, what do you mean by that?
So baiting ults. So when we talked about the different types of ults that exist, we talked about how some ults are just going to be used in one way and the other ult might just be used as a form of rebuttal. So we used it, this example right here of maybe putting down KJ ult and then expecting something like, for example, Sova ult, right? You can look at Hunter's Fury as a counter to KJ ult. So what you can do is you can use these types of ults to bait. You can use it to bait in the form of maybe extracting some sort of information out of how the enemy setup is playing, or maybe, for example, you can use it as a form of getting rid of a really important ult. So maybe you can use KJ ult so Sova doesn't have his ult on post plant. And if you don't really get that ult out of them, then you can instead use it as a way of getting information. If they're not using the Sova ult on the KJ ult, then they're going to be using it for post plant. You can use it to essentially work your way down and identify what the strategy of the opponent is. You can also just keep it at its most fundamental level and maybe fake a site with the intention of either thinking the opponent's going to be returning back with an ult, or you can do it to scare the opponents. I already talked about how a KJ can drop down their ult in a panic to avoid the enemy team taking that site. So you can do things like that. There's a lot of different ways in which you can bait it. But the way that I was talking about it is simply make sure you're looking at what ults are being used and what else you can use to kind of like fight them back. What ults you can use to kind of counter. Okay. So baiting is a form of, or at least a strat of being able to keep that up. Okay. I might have not developed too much on that point, but that's pretty much the way that it should go. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. We're a little bit over time now. If anyone has any questions, let me know now. 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm going to close the class. Let's get going on to the script.